we have a studio audience, which is your cue, studio audience, to say good evening, good evening, good evening, good studio audience. They listen very nicely. It's always good when a studio audience obeys an instruction before we go on air. A panel discussion this evening with erudite members of the investment community, of the financial services sector, people having a party in the background as well this evening, which is part of tonight's festivities. The Chief Executive of Corporate Investment Banking at Standard Bank, Kenny Fiedler, is with us this evening. We've got Dr. Martin Davies, the Managing Director of Emerging Markets for Africa at Deloitte. We've got Sandile Shope, who's Partner and Africa Region Government and Public Sector Leader at EY, and Peter Attard-Montalto, the Head of Capital Markets Research at Intellidex. I just want to give you a summary of how Bloomberg has seen the World Economic Forum for Africa play out over the last couple of days. And I'm afraid if you're of a sensitive disposition, you may take some offense to this, because this is Bloomberg's view. The World Economic Forum for Africa was supposed to be South African President Cyril Ramaphosa's chance to prove his nation's claim to being the continent's top investment destination. It's all gone horribly wrong. The lead up to the gathering of political and business leaders in Cape Town was marred by a series of xenophobic attacks, with scores of foreign-owned businesses burned and looted, mass protests against horrific abuse of women. A demonstration was held outside the WEF meeting on Wednesday, and then of course today as well, and police fired stun grenades and water cannons, and it carries on like that. Peter Attard-Montalto from Intellidex, it was supposed to play out quite differently from an economic perspective.
Well, exactly. I think when we come to these WEF events, we love wearing our badges, we love sort of charging around, having important meetings, and it's a bit of a game and a show, and normally a government puts on a very good show and everyone is happy to play along. Unfortunately, it didn't work like that this time. I think it really coincides actually with business asking a lot of very challenging questions about what the difference between putting on a show and PR is versus actual implementation, actually. In that sense, it was unfortunate. But also, I think, given the timing and the lack of foreign leaders that ended up coming here as a result of the xenophobic violence. And the protesters, actually, against sexual violence, they were very interesting. I was outside speaking to some of them, and I thought they actually made a very powerful case, and ultimately forced, of course, the president to come out and address them outside Parliament today.
It was a very effective protest, and it's done, hopefully, a lot of good. Let's get a view, Sandile, from you this evening, from an EY perspective. I mean, you talk about dialogue can only be effective if it's followed by action, and it's one of the greatest criticisms, not only of World Economic Forum events like this, where people get on terribly nicely, and it's cocktail parties, and it's meetings, and it's handshakes and backslapping, all of those nice things. But a bit like South Africa, implementation of any bright idea doesn't really follow suit, and that, I think, is your primary concern.
Yeah, correct. Good evening, Bruce, and thanks for having me on your show. I think the important thing, what we're learning, is that citizen activism is actually increasing significantly in most geographies, including our own. And also with the advent of social media, people are able to connect and express their issues and frustrations quite quickly. The key thing is that with any change that you're driving, good thing to have a plan, but people want to see progress on that plan. And I think that's really the message we are getting from the people in the street, in terms of how do you begin to progress those very great plans that you have. That said, I think there's still very good potential for the continent and South African country indeed to actually move forward in actually driving some of those programs forward.
I mean, what sort of meetings have you had at this World Economic Forum? I mean, that's the highlight of this thing, of course, is not necessarily what's on the agenda, but what you are able to achieve and get up to behind the scenes.
Yeah, so I've had some very interesting meetings with a couple of government officials, and actually yesterday evening I attended the South African government dinner hosted by the President Cyril, and then at each table you had the various ministers where we were having discussions on different topics. I think there were 11 tables, 11 different topics. And at my table, which was chaired by the very enigmatic Minister Sisulu, we were tasked with answering the question, how can we drive inclusive growth through innovation? And some really great ideas came out of that. And I think at the end, when the President summarized, the tables came out with 59 different ideas.
Oh, no, not 59 different ideas. We always have 59 ideas.
59 ideas is very good. So the challenge that we as business, obviously the business people, but we put to the President was fantastic, we've given you great ideas. What you now need to do is find all those things and prioritize and figure out which of those three can you do in an agile implementation method, which is every 3 months, see what you can pull out. And the challenge that was put forward by the facilitator was that really we need to think about ideas that can be implemented today.
Yeah.
So not things that you're going to try and lift and change. So one of the big ones was around visas for people coming to work.
Anybody.
And at our
Yes.
table, there was a gentleman who's come into the country to work for the Melinda Gates Foundation. It took him 11 months to get a work permit to come into the country. The president took it upon to say that's something they can fix tomorrow.
Yeah, we hope so. We certainly do hope so. And I mean, your chief executive, Sim Chabalala, issuing an angry statement. I mean, Sim is a mild-mannered guy. At the best of times, you may see the other side of him when targets aren't met, I'm sure. But publicly, at least, he's a mild-mannered guy. But a deeply angry statement coming through from Sim Chabalala, saying this is the second time as chief executive of Standard Bank he's been obliged to come out and comment about xenophobia and to talk about xenophobia. And with a presence across the continent that you have got, this becomes a very high-risk game for a South African corporate operating in other parts of the continent. It's a big downside, isn't it? I mean, South Africans, they've let you down this week.
Look, I mean, I think the acts of xenophobia should be condemned. They are deplorable. They've got no place in the modern world, no place in South Africa or anywhere else in the world. Clearly, as a business that operates in 20 African countries, we are particularly sensitive to anything that seems to suggest that non-South Africans are not welcomed in South Africa because skills transfer, movement of capital, movement of goods, movement of services is paramount to the economic development of our economies and of South Africa in particular, just given the opportunities that are presented by oil and gas in Mozambique, oil in East Africa, the oil restructuring in Nigeria, as well as many other opportunities, given that the GDP growth in East and West Africa are substantially higher than GDP growth in South Africa, and consequently, therefore, South African companies have opportunities for expansion and for growth in those markets. So xenophobia is very parochial and quite frankly counterproductive, and it ought to be condemned.
It should be condemned and should be stamped out. Martin Davies, I mean, if ever there was anybody who treats World Economic Forum gatherings like a kid in a candy store, it is Dr. Martin Davies from Deloitte. I mean, this is like your favorite time of the year. You get to Davos, you get to hear. I mean, this is your happy place, Martin Davies.
I think it's important, Bruce, that I'm disappointed you've never referred to me as a mild-mannered guy like you did Sim. But
you
no matter.
You must issue an angry statement, and then I've got the counter, and then I can say, but he's such a mild-mannered guy. Look at the statement.
Look, I think let's think back. There was a hiatus last year. There was no World Economic Forum in Africa.
Yeah.
Had we held this event this time last year, we would still be in the throes, the hype of Ramaphosa, would we not?
I suspect we would be, yeah.
And I want to quote, I think it was Arthur Miller, a US playwright, who said that an era is over when its basic illusions have been exhausted.
Sure, that's highbrow. I mean, but just extrapolate on that point, please, because it is a critical one. Because we've lost the idea of the dream, and somehow we have to recapture the dream and recapture it quickly. Otherwise, the veneer of everything's going to be okay disappears.
I think we were, as South Africans, academic phrase, the political economy of South Africa was expecting a V-shaped recovery. We have moved from, arguably, structural decline to drift.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing at the forum formally in the confines of the Cape Town Convention Centre, and what I'm seeing, as Peter referred to, externally in the protests, is we are tired of drift. We need action. We need leadership. We need direction. We need a strong state. We need focus. We need discipline. We need action. And that's what I'm referring to.
We're becoming very internally focused on South Africa. We are in South Africa. We are South Africans. We're worried about South African problems. But possibly one of the solutions to digging ourselves out of the hole that we're in is greater cooperation across this continent, greater working together. And it's a pity that many leaders didn't come to this World Economic Forum gathering in Cape Town to go and work toward those solutions. But one of the things that bugs anybody, I was on a plane this morning listening to a very loud man telling his is the man next to him, all about, he is in the trucking business, and he does trucking across Africa, and the blockages that happen in places like Bight Bridge and the border between the DRC and Zambia, and places where just, you can have queues of trucks of 45 kilometers as bribes get extracted, and as the rent-seeking economy gets its share first before people are allowed to cross borders and things. I mean, fundamentally, freedom of movement has got to be something that as Africans we have to come to terms with, despite South Africa's approach to xenophobia, for example.
Bruce, if I may say, I think often there's a dangerous confusion with democracy and anarchy, two very different things.
Yep.
And I think South Africa, I was saying to some US attendees, some WEF delegates from the US earlier, and using an American phrase which resonated quite well. I said, South Africa has fantastic institutions, albeit eroded somewhat in recent times, but no matter, they're there. I've never come across a country like our own where we have such strong goodwill and latent goodwill in our society. And using an American phrase, if we got our act together, we could really turn on a dime. Unlike many other countries in this region, we don't have the assets, the institutions, the goodwill, the capabilities that we have. It's just a question of what's going to turn it. The state will turn it. Leadership will turn it. We, unfortunately, as private sector, we do our best, but I think we remain arguably spectators often to the process.
And that is unfortunate. I mean, Peter Montalto, do you see regional cooperation boosting the continent? I mean, East Africa's got a really interesting economic bloc going on. West Africa's got a really interesting economic bloc on. South Africa's got SADC, and that's not working brilliantly. Greater cooperation across this continent.
Well, there has actually been a lot of excitement at these Welcome Economic Forum meetings. On the outside of the meetings, Martin's had a great schedule. They've been in West Africa, and the banks have hosted various things. And actually, you have got a sense of buzz of innovation going on in the rest of Africa, of companies simply getting on with it in these regional blocks, and to a contained degree. And I think the question I've been really poking around at these meetings with the private sector, with the public sector, is how do you implement this joining up of the continent in any meaningful time frame? And people haven't really been able to answer that. We can all agree on the amount of extra internal trade that can happen. It can basically quadruple under the free trade agreement. We can agree on the number of jobs that will create. But actually sequencing this and seeing the political will to overcome those problems on the borders, to be able to link up and create those value chains across borders is still somewhat elusive. So
is it a pipe dream?
Well, I think it's a necessary pipe dream, certainly.
Okay.
I think you have to start somewhere. But there are so many companies waiting to do so many interesting things, and that's the buzz that's come around from some of these side events. Is people building these these regional blocks. But then government, I think that buzz has basically then seen nothing come from the public sector. That's been a disappointment of these meetings overall.
Perhaps the private sector should just go ahead. Fourth Industrial Revolution, it is a couple of years ago, innovation was the most overused term in business anywhere. Now, Fourth Industrial Revolution, I went to a launch of a Fourth Industrial Revolution project with the president. It was sponsored by Telkom about 8 weeks ago. And there was almost a sense that we could, Sandile Hlope from EY, sort of somehow the Fourth Industrial Revolution is going to make everything okay. We talk about it in this very distant sort of idea that this Fourth Industrial Revolution will fix everything. And we forget that between us and the Fourth Industrial Revolution is 1 billion people who need to be uplifted, 1 billion people who need to eat tomorrow, who can't wait for us to get our act together on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It's a bit of a frustration, and it feels quite disconnected from people's lived experience on the African continent. Comment?
Yeah, sure. The Fourth Industrial Revolution does present opportunities to be able to accelerate some of these implementation challenges that most governments across Africa are experiencing. I think just to touch back to your Africa integration point earlier on, I think one of the most significant agreements that have been signed in the last year was the African Free Trade Continental Agreement. What that does is kind of close to 54 countries have agreed to say they'll be able to open up borders and make that work. Now, that policy enablement is good in theory, but how do you go about implementing it?
But it's a piece of paper right now, and
Correct.
Nobody seems to have a real grip on how it's going to be practically...
And this is where your technology gives you the opportunity to bring that to life. To use a very simple example, say I am in South Africa and I want to go and sell some goods and services into Zimbabwe and find markets. Today, as we're saying, I would have to get onto a car, drive across the border, go and figure out, is there a market, at what price can I sell my services before I can actually move that. What technology allows you to do, you can remotely sitting in South Africa, you'd be able to study the market in Zim, get the pricing, get your ordering and placing done online from that perspective. So there are certain progresses being made in most countries, particularly in the East Africa region, so in countries like Kenya and Rwanda. So Rwanda is now actually using drones to distribute blood from transfusion services across the state. So those are the type of things that are allowing centralized blood services storage and then distributing remotely. South Africa, though, needs to play catch-up. We're probably 5 years behind the East region. This is where a lot of the work needs to go into. So a lot of the conversation in our country has been more around the theory, what can 4R do, which is where we are proposing that we need to move now to say, what are the building blocks that you actually need to enable this to happen? We've got real live examples, as I've given, in our neighboring countries. Use that to pick that up.
Martin Davies, after Tito Mboweni, you're probably the biggest fan of the economic miracle of Rwanda. And I mean, Rwanda is a case study that South Africa certainly can't emulate. It's a much smaller economy, a much possibly less complicated economy to work in. But certainly the lessons from Rwanda that Tito Mboweni does espouse regularly, and the lessons of Paul Kagame, are things that we should be taking to heart and, dare I say, implementing.
I think there are two, how can I say, examples in our region where you have developmental lessons cut and pasted from Asia transplanted into Africa. One is Rwanda, one is Ethiopia. And it's about creating highly functional states. But it's not just about the institutions, it's about, more importantly, it's the mindset and culture of performance of the state. Arguably maybe a democratic consultation, but a ruthless implementation of very pragmatic policies which are incredibly predictable, very nimble, agile to attract foreign capital. And rightfully so. These countries, Ethiopia accommodating, Rwanda certainly down the tracks in terms of doing it, but are incredibly pro-capital. And understand, in talking about free trade, the major proponent has been Rwanda, a small, aspirational, landlocked country in Africa. And full understanding, it's trying to emulate a Singapore, we often talk about it's trying to emulate a Switzerland. And what does Switzerland have in terms of comparative advantage? It has nothing. It has 8 million people and a few cows.
And chocolate.
And chocolate, but that's it. But it's one of the world's most wealthiest economies. Rwanda's trying to figure it out, but most importantly is laying the necessary bedrock of a functional state upon which you can progress.
Peter Anton Montalto, I must ask you this question, because you've been following South Africa for a long time, your previous job in Namura, and now you pay very, very close attention to what happens in South Africa. You've seen figureheads of government departments come and go over time. You've seen some awful ones, you've seen some terrible ones, some bad ones, and hopefully occasionally some very good leaders within government. Do you get a sense, Martin Davies' view on this, that you need a ruthless implementation of good ideas? Do you get any sense whatsoever that we are making progress towards that point relative to where we have been in the past?
Well, it comes back to this functioning of the state. I think we've spoken a lot on this program before about the lack of functioning of the state, the inability to deploy central political capital downwards with accountability as well, and have reporting back up so the centre knows what's going on. Fundamentally, the state doesn't really work like that. And so it's very hard for there to be central direction from the president, from cabinet even, down the value chain down through the civil service.
Which explains why this dream of the developmental state in South Africa simply hasn't worked, because it's been ineffective.
Exactly, and it's how things like earlier in the year, the change to the key skills list came out without anyone knowing in the presidency, for instance. Despite there's been a major negative signal for people. And I think really that's the area where the president hasn't got a grip at the moment, is changing the state. And that's what he could have done very early on. For instance, he'd done no actual policy change in the first year, but changed the functioning of the state. We could have got on board and said, we can give some benefits of the doubt, and this is what's going to happen the following year. And because of this lack of change of the functioning of the state, it's why we're so negative on things like visas changing, and the ability to deploy policy on that. And what you really need is a total reconception of the presidency as a very nimble deployer of political capital in the style of the Western Cape government that Helen Zille put in place with the delivery unit, basically, and being able to basically go into departments with baseball bats, right? And that's what you need to go into
Be careful
Home
when you
Affairs.
make suggestions like that in South Africa today. Somebody might take you literally, Peter.
Well, that's what you need in Home Affairs, I think, to change the visa regime.
There are many
for
people
instance.
may agree with you on that particular point. But the point is, you're not seeing it, which is concerning. You're not seeing that we are amending our ability to make the state more effective as a catalyst for the growth that we need here to become a more effective implementer of growth on this continent.
But the problem is this lack of change, I think, is really cementing business sentiment in a very, very negative place. And I think there has been a degree of irrationality almost creeping into the business view on sentiment around things like the IMF. People have a much tighter time frame than is realistic. But one senior business leader said to me the other week when the Tito plan was published, something that quite shocked me. And what they said was, even if we implement all this, nothing will happen in terms of growth. And I don't think that's true, but I think that sort of encapsulates this very deep sense of negativity.
Who is that person? And can
I can't say.
Give me their phone number. Let's put them on now and let's have a debate. But the problem is we're becoming quite defeatist in our approach. We simply don't believe even good news stories anymore because we feel so browbeat.
But I think there's a strategic sort of game theory view in government, basically, where everyone, in a social compacting sense, has to take a step forward at the same time. Through the sort of grand theory, if you like. And I don't think that's fundamentally how the world works. Someone has to have a first mover position or advantage, and doing some small thing, like changing the state, like visas. And that's the central view, central role, I think, ultimately, of the presidency, to make those kind of leadership decisions.
We live in hope, we do, Peter, and I know that hope is not a strategy. But in South Africa, if you don't have hope, you need gin, and that doesn't help anybody. We've got an outside broadcast. We're in Cape Town on the sidelines. I do like that turn of phrase, the sidelines of the World Economic Forum 2019. It has not been the world's most extraordinary gathering. There seems to be a lot of interesting discussion happening within the World Economic Forum, but I think there's always a sense of frustration at these sort of gatherings, that we don't feel some sort of miraculous progress. We don't see somebody coming up and saying, you know what, I can solve the problem and we're going to do it like this. We don't get that sort of solution coming through. But Peter Adelmontota, I know that you have a dinner to go to. You put on your best rags, so we're going to let you go this evening. And we'll come back after Eyewitness News. Kenny Fiedler, with a banking presence across the African continent, a very strong banking presence across the African continent. What is the Standard Bank view on growth prospects, not only for the continent, but how we as South Africa play a role in driving business north and how we benefit from the higher growth rates that we're seeing north of our borders? We'll pick up on that in a couple of minutes' time. It's time for Eyewitness News. We are live at the World Economic Forum 2019. Standard Bank is hosting us in Bree Street in Cape Town. We've got a marvelous panel for you this evening. The head of corporate and investment banking at Standard Bank is Kenny Fiedler. Talk to him in just a moment about the Africa opportunity. Dr. Martin Davies, managing director of emerging markets and Africa at Deloitte, and Sandile Hlophe, a partner and Africa region government and public sector leader at EY, with us this evening as well. Kenny Fiedler mentioned just before the break that Standard Bank has got a very, very strong African presence. I mean, the economies that you're in, varying degrees of growth and opportunity coming through there. Talk to me about integration and the great Africa growth opportunity that we need to seize.
Bruce, I think that there's a lot that Africa ought to do. If one looks at the development opportunities, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, Mozambique, the gas opportunity, which will require investment capital of close to $100 billion. Mozambique does not have that amount of capital. It opens up opportunities for financial institutions in South Africa and all over the world. The investment that is required will be spent on building infrastructure, drilling wells, building the LNG plants. South Africa has the institutional capacity to have captured that opportunity and leverage it to also support its own growth for its own companies and skills. If you go further north, East Africa, the oil opportunity in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, again, the level of capital that's required is massive. And we've got the capacity to support that, not only as South African financial institutions, but in partnership with the rest of the world. If you take all of these and start to multiply it across the various countries in the continent, you'll realize that, quite frankly, there's just so much that can be achieved. If only governments can do the following: make it easy for people to come and invest. When we talk about the growth of Africa, governments do not grow economies. What they do is to create an environment that makes it easy for people to invest, and in that process begin to drive economic growth, job creation, and ultimately the upliftment of the standard of living of the people. And I think that's what government should be focusing on. How do you make it easy for people to come and invest? Can they repatriate their capitals? Can they bring skills that are required to develop and build these industries? And are they able, therefore, to repatriate services and goods that come at the back of that production capacity?
Why do they find it so hard?
I think there's a lot of parochial interest, which tends to be driven by short-term imperatives. Unfortunately, short-term imperatives are there to please the electorate, but ultimately they do not build economies and do not create sustainability. I think government needs to focus on basic things that are required by industry. South Africa needs skills. How do we deal then with issues of immigration? It's not just about people coming in here, it's about the skills that we need to grow our own economy. Mozambique requires capital. How do you make it easy for people to invest and take out the red tapes and simplify regulations? Kenya requires the development of its own natural resources and agriculture as well as oil. How do you make it easy for agricultural companies and oil companies to invest in that economy? Government needs to build its focus based on real opportunities that business can follow on.
I mean, you're being critical, and rightly so, of other African countries, but all of those things can be as equally applied to South Africa as other countries too.
Of course, they do apply. And I think part of the challenge with government is that we try and boil the ocean. You can't fix everything at once. You have to prioritize and have a sense of agency. Yes. I think trying to fix everything at once is as good as not doing anything, because you'll never succeed, you'll fail. Prioritize on things that matter and focus your best people and your best resources on dealing with those. I think that's what government needs, and that's what South Africa needs.
You can't boil the ocean. It's the first time I've heard that one. Thank you for that. I may use it. But I will credit you. Of course I will. That's a good line. Martin Davies, give me a sense, please, of the growth opportunities. So Kenny's busy talking about big capital opportunities, big capital growth opportunities, big investment opportunities, big opportunities for African economies to liberalize and to bring skills in to grow their economies, take a 20-year view and say, this is the plan and this is how we're executing on it. Yes, good and noble. Your perspective on growth opportunities for this continent?
Look, I think the game, Bruce, is as follows, is that we've seen, if we think back of SA Inc. in Africa 1.0, we had first movers shaping sectors and industries. I'll name them. Companies like MTN Vodacom, to mobile telcos, banking, undoubtedly Standard Bank, retail, ShopRite, Massmart, logistics, Imperial largely, Bollywood to an extent. These are companies that, and there's many others, who've moved up north. I won't say to Africa, it sounds like we're somewhere else.
Exactly. I mean, to other African countries, yes.
Went north, ventured north to seek fortune, were able to shape the sectors and, most importantly, consolidate markets, about capturing markets, consolidating, growing businesses, and ultimately, we are capitalists after all, shareholder value. That's what it is. My sort of realization this week, and we have this argument about, with debate about political economy and the role of state, I think we have sufficient corporate muscle. And a word that's been overused here this past few days is ecosystem. But how do we start thinking about really creating ecosystems? Private sector led, it's fine. And we're working as Deloitte with many governments in the region, but marrying sort of, we talk about trade policy with industrial policy and functioning of state, bringing our resources to bear to formalize sectors. Africa needs formalization. If your economies are not formalizing, you're not collecting rents as a state, you're not increasing revenues, there's not much you can do about it. So how do we formalize very informal economies? And I think often, sure, regulatory environments are very complex and burdensome at times for business. But how do we start? Often, and Standard Bank knows this better than most people, or companies, is capturing flows of capital, because often the flows happen regardless of borders. So you'll have, for example, an economy, a half joke called Namgola. It's northern Namibia, it's southern Angola.
You're spending time with Donald Trump.
We see it, well, not, it's, what was his, Nambia.
Nambia, yes.
Maybe he plagiarized me in some respect.
Possibly.
But in a bad way. But we see it in Mpumalanga, Mozambique. The stores, the commerce is in one side of a border, but
Musina and Zimbabwe.
exactly.
I mean,
but the
it's the same.
spend comes from literally a different country.
Yeah.
So one needs to understand the dynamics of Africa. That's what Stanbic does very well in terms of having this wide footprint, but capturing flows. And the liquidity is there. I mean, I had a leading logistics company say to me recently that they can't believe their growth. I mean, high double-digit growth of e-commerce in Nigeria. The macro in Nigeria does not talk about growth at all, just the opposite. But this company cannot understand, was shocked as to how, and I heard this week again, is to the liquidity in Nigeria on e-commerce, Nigerians buying predominantly luxury goods from European websites, and the logistics company is delivering literally like 3-4 days later for a greater price than the actual product purchased into Lagos or Abuja or Port Harcourt or wherever it may be. The macro doesn't show that. The opportunity, the liquidity, Bruce, is there.
It is.
It's a question of how do our companies become innovative and capture it.
One of the greatest storytellers, South African businessman doing business in other parts of Africa, was Whitey Basson. And he would tell us about stories of bottle store. There was one bottle store somewhere in Nigeria, possibly in Abuja, that would sell more Moët Chandon than all of his stores in South Africa put together, simply because there is a market. There are markets for goods. Mark Davies, I mean, people talk about the demographic dividend for Africa. I'm petrified for the year 2050 when we've got hundreds of millions of young people who have no prospects because we're not laying adequate groundwork now to grow these economies for them to benefit from 20 and 30 years from now.
Well, Bruce, I was in Japan last week, the highest median age of population in the world, over 48 years of age. The youngest is Niger, something like 15. We're somewhere in between. But soundbite, in 2025, I'm told by the United Nations, that there'll be more Africans than Chinese. And that's significant. That's in 5 years' time.
It is significant.
And demography
what are
is
their
destiny.
prospects?
Demography is economic destiny.
Yeah.
But I think this is going to be, and what is happening, we had a session today at the forum on the new scramble for Africa. And that elicits quite a lot of emotion to it. The new scramble, new actors, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, the Turks, whoever it may be. Even the South Africans to an extent. We're a new actor. But it comes down to, is how do we best leverage the opportunities that are being created and by these new actors. But the demography issue is Africa Rising may be slightly obsolete, but it's happening. Africa Rising 2.0, and it's about the consumer. It's an FMCG play, predominantly.
It is an FMCG play, but if there aren't economies to support the populations to become those consumers, then we have a problem. Are we doing things fast enough for this continent? Are we creating a base for this continent that is going to support these young people?
If you're an FMCG company, this is fantastic news. If you're a developmental economist, it's deeply concerning. Same situation, two very different narratives.
Yeah.
I think there's a business view, there's a developmental view, there's a political view, but ultimately you have to have true, states that understand the fundamentals of state creation. And this is a challenge of South Africa, and I often say this is our issue, and you spoke to it, Kenny, is you tell me about a failed state, I'll tell you about a failed nation. We need to have better coherent nations in Africa upon which we can start to build sustainable economies.
Are we then trying to put the cart before the horse in terms of the Africa growth story? If we don't have stable nations, if we don't have working nations, are we not then putting our focus in the wrong place?
I think there's the challenges we have and the confusion also at the forum this week is 4IR is bandied about, and that's very relevant. States need to constantly innovate. Otherwise, we need to thrive. Otherwise, we will continue to be in structural decline. And we must be talking about 4IR, understanding it, and shaping and implementing policies around it. But at the same time, we have a very wide spectrum of needs and basic requirements in our economies. Where do we focus? We've been pulled in some different directions. Whether you're in Singapore or even in China, you don't really quite have the same spectrum of needs, serving different constituencies and literally different economies that are coexisting in different eras.
Yeah.
different eras.
Let's get the view this evening then on Sandile Hlophe, who's also with us on our panel as we do an outside broadcast this evening from Bree Street in Cape Town on the edge of the World Economic Forum Africa 2019. Sandile is a partner in Africa Region Government and Public Sector Leader at EY. What do you see for this continent 2050 in terms of the opportunity that feasibly can be seized to make this a prosperous continent, to make this the next growth engine of the globe? Because the world needs it to work. We need it to work. We live here, for goodness sake. We need this continent to prosper.
Yeah, we see great prospect, Bruce, and mainly because of two things. I think the first thing Martin has alluded to, we've got one of the youngest populations in the world, and that will grow significantly. That means potentially we've got access to human capital to deliver more goods and services going in the future, and consumers. The second thing we have in our continent is that we don't have any technology legacy issues. So this also presents an opportunity for us.
It's such a positive spin on the fact that there's no technology. But we don't have any legacy issues. That's a positive, right? Got you.
Correct, yeah. So, but the issue about the legacy part is important because for us to adopt a lot of these new technologies that are being talked about in the 4IR, you would have to navigate across those, redo your cabling, take out the servers. But because we don't have those legacy technology, as the continent, we can leapfrog and adopt those technologies much faster. Hence why we're seeing more technology investment, digital investment into the continent. Companies like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft putting down sort of a very advanced cloud technology solutions, innovate, because it takes them quicker to do it. So more and more when we're conversing with governments, we really talk to them about two things. The first thing we say to them, you really need to imagine and think about a two-speed world. And by two-speed world, we actually mean that if you think about it, most government terms are 4 to 5 years at best. But they then go out and lay out policies that will come to fruition in 5 years' time. Then we say, but hang on, you fund your annual government spend annually through revenue collection and so forth. So why would you want to try and put down a 5-year plan when you've got a 1-year funding strategy? So the two-speed says government needs to think more short-term around what are the things I can unlock today, parts of my policy to enable business to work.
Don't try and boil the ocean.
100%.
In terms of getting,
And a good analogy.
Especially the Atlantic Ocean.
Please don't.
So step one is government, think about a two-speed walk, yours is short-term. Then what you do is the capital funders you're talking to, business, FDI, they are more long-term investment types now because businesses and various funders need to have a 10, 20 horizon, especially where we are investing people's pension funds, where we are trying 20, 30 years. So, which is what Kenny was alluding to. He needs a 20-year outlook, and then he'll have the confidence to put down the capital. So if you then marry the two to then say government seeks to implement their policies quicker and shorter, do smaller things that are doable versus trying to do long-term, you will then get alignment between government policy and capital requirements.
And there's nothing more empowering anywhere than achieving goals. And if you're setting short-term goals and you're achieving short-term goals in quick succession, it suddenly becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You start believing you can do it, and suddenly the bigger goals become less daunting. We love long-term goals because you think everybody is looking at what you're saying will be dead by the time you're supposed to have achieved them anyway. So we don't actually have to do anything, and then you sit back and don't. Yeah, absolutely.
And sorry, secondly, the other thing we talk to governments a lot about, to then say, right, you've got these really great ideas and you want to implement them, but think about incremental investments versus trying to do big bang.
Yeah.
If you think about the wonderful stories of the countries that have been successful, your Rwandas and Chinas, we're seeing the results now 10, 15 years. We all go and say, wow, Rwanda looks like, but they started 10 years ago.
We behave like millennials.
Now.
We want everything now. We've got such a short-term focus because we've got populations who are feeling left out. We've got populations who have been very distant from power. They've been very distant from economic benefit. And they don't want to wait 10 or 15 years. That's a lifetime.
It's always a challenge for any emerging economy where you've got a large young population. Government tends to feel the pressure that they need to do things much quicker. But if you do smaller things, Bruce, you can do things in 90 days. So when we talk about short-term goals, we're saying to government, think about implementing your very lovely, great policies to say what can be put into place in 30 days out of that policy. The next of 30 days, in the 90 days, you say, I'll see a goal and an outcome. Because by doing that, you're getting that progress type scenario.
Martin Davies, technology. I mean, we forget the great technology miracle, and I hate using the M-Pesa example because it feels like it's the only example that we can use because that's the great success story. But by using cell phone technology for the first time, as the likes of MTN and Vodacom expanded through the African continent, M-Pesa was born out of Vodafone and changed the way financial services worked across Kenya. Suddenly, the digital revolution and the ability to not have the dreadful legacy issues of technology means that we have got a huge opportunity to leapfrog, dare I say, toward the fourth industrial revolution. You look somewhat concerned about that.
Bruce, you're holding up your phone, so I'll do the same. This is a tool for business, a tool of business. It's not a tool of development.
Ooh, good, yes. Extrapolate.
So why is it for 20-odd years there's more of these mobile phones, smart or dumb phones in Nigeria than any other country on the continent? And yet why is poverty increasing in Nigeria? 125 million people live on less than $2 a day in that country, which is just politically, socially, economically, morally unacceptable.
But that same argument goes for the fourth industrial revolution is going to fix everything. Cell phones were supposed to fix everything.
But
they didn't.
This is a means and provocative point. Again, companies, and rightfully so, make money from this. And the services they provide, it's fantastic, but it ain't a tool for development. And I think also the narrative you mentioned, and there's so many others, I've never seen a country, I've never seen a company or an individual get rich through spending. You get rich through saving and reinvesting. Yeah. That's the Asia story. So let's not talk about the miracles and the fantastic tech that encourages us to spend. Where's the fantastic tech that encourages us to save?
I'm sure there's an app for that somewhere, Martin.
I'm going to do a search right now, and that's what I think we need to be thinking about. We talk too simplistically and superficially around capturing the spend.
Yeah.
And these are our fellow Africans who are poor people. Let's encourage them to save a bit more.
Save what? I suppose they will say to you, Martin Davies, but thank you, Martin. Kenny Feet, I'm going to give the last word to you this evening. Beyond the massive capital spending projects, which are the great opportunity for a 20-year view, some short-term wins for us and our continent?
I think there's a lot, Bruce. I'll give you an example. I was in Uganda a couple of weeks ago, and the Uganda example
that must be the busiest airport in the world. I mean,
applies to anywhere.
Kigali, Parliament of the busiest
but
airport.
let me tell you why that example is relevant. And I visited the Lake Albert region, or where these Lake Alfred region, where these oil fields are. What was interesting with the region is that even though not a single well outside of testing has been drilled yet, the road infrastructure is being built now. Because you cannot access and be able to develop the oil wells unless you build the road. The airport is being built now. Camps are being built to accommodate people. And those people need to be fed, uniforms need to be produced, they need to be clothed, there are safety issues that need to be provided, there's training and development that is taking place immediately. So even when we think about these long-term projects, ultimately we have to start today. You create jobs today. So governments need to make decisions today for opportunities that relate to oil, which may happen in 20 years' time. But there's a lot of money flow in development and training and feeding. And employment of people that's going to happen today. South Africa needs to do the same. The mining sector, there's massive underinvestment in the mining sector. We've been talking about the mining charter engagement for the last 10 years. That's opportunity lost. Just finalizing that, you unlock the investment capital of business.
Just act.
Just doing that, because there's underinvestment. The capacity is running out. Companies and mining sector is cash flush, but people are not investing. Why? Because of regulatory hiatus and the indecision that is currently taking place. Let's have a sense of urgency on things that matter, and business will follow.
Kenny Fietler, thank you. He is the head of corporate investment banking at Standard Bank. Martin Davies from Deloitte, and also Sandile Hlophe this evening from EY. Panel, thank you very much. With Peter Atot Montalto from Intellidex also joined us this evening. To our lovely audience here in Cape Town this evening, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for listening to this evening's edition of The Money Show, live from the World Economic Forum in Cape Town. Good night.
WEF Africa 2019. Brought to you by Standard Bank 702 and Cape Talk. More at ewn.co.za.